What happens if you let a ship full of oil sit in the ocean for 8 years without any maintenance? This is exactly the nightmare scenario the UN recently had to contemplate. Hi there, everyone. I'm Jeff, and this is Plain English lesson number 606. Remember, at Plain English, we help you upgrade your English with stories about current events and trending topics. We have a lot of engineers in the audience, a lot of people who work in the oil industry, logistics, shipping, things like that. And today's story is for you. An oil storage ship moored off the coast of Yemen has been left in a state of disrepair, left to decay in the middle of the Red Sea. And it had 1 million barrels of oil inside. Today, we'll tell you about the crazy story of the FSO Safer and the mad diplomatic rush to avert an environmental catastrophe. In the second half of today's lesson, I'll show you how to use the English expression accident waiting to happen. And we have a quote of the week. Let's get going. The FSO Safer is an oil storage and offloading vessel. A vessel is a ship, like a big boat, and the Safer was a vessel with one job: store oil. It began its life in the 1970s as an oil tanker. It was built in Japan, and it was, and still is, one of the biggest tankers ever built. It was so big that officers used to ride bicycles on the deck to get from point A to point B faster. Its job was to transport oil, to take oil from one place in the world to another. But in the 1980s, it got a new owner: the government of Yemen. Yemen is a country in the Arabian Peninsula, directly south of Saudi Arabia and across the Red Sea from the eastern coast of Africa. When Yemen bought the vessel, it turned it into a storage and offloading vessel. What does that mean? Well, Yemen is an oil-producing country in an oil-rich part of the world. It pumps oil on land, but to get that oil to market, it exports the oil via ocean-going tankers. So Yemen needed a place to store its oil before it could be loaded onto a tanker for shipment. Now, that could either be on land or it could be out at sea. For logistical reasons, it's sometimes easier to store the oil out at sea so that it can be easily loaded onto a tanker ship far from the coast. And that's what the Safer was for. Yemen would store oil on the Safer while it waited to ship the oil out to the market. The Safer was moored 5 miles off Yemen's western coast in the Red Sea. The Safer worked great until Yemen's civil war broke out in 2014. Shortly after the war started, a rebel group called the Houthis took control of the capital and other parts of the country. And one part the rebels took over was the coastline where the Safer was moored. At the time, the Safer was holding 1.1 million barrels of oil. Now, both sides in Yemen's civil war claimed ownership of the oil. Both sides wanted the tens of millions of dollars worth of oil on board, but neither side could get the money. The internationally recognized government couldn't access the ship because the rebels controlled the coast and they had weapons. But the rebels, for all their firepower, they couldn't sell the oil on the market. They were not the rightful owners, so no one would buy from them. So instead, the rebels used the Safer and the oil it held as leverage in their conflict. And so, in the intervening years, during the Civil War, the Safer and the oil sat and sat and sat. Eventually, most of the Safer's crew abandoned the ship. They weren't being paid. Those who stayed were routinely threatened with violence. A skeleton crew of only about 6 people remained. At one point in 2015, just a single worker was on board. It goes without saying that nobody did preventative maintenance. The ship's maintenance budget went from $20 million per year to zero. In the early 2020s, the United Nations and other international organizations realized that this was an environmental accident waiting to happen. To put this in perspective, one of the worst environmental disasters in world history was the Exxon Valdez oil spill off the coast of Alaska in 1989. The Safer held 4 times more oil than that oil spill in Alaska. What's more, the oil that was on the Safer is called Marib Light, a type of crude oil that mixes more easily with water. And that means in case of a spill, it would be harder to clean up. Studies suggested that if the Safer disintegrated, spilling all its oil into the ocean, it would cause untold economic and environmental damage. It would wipe out fish in the area for a generation. A lot of Yemenis rely on fish and fishing for their livelihoods. A spill would disrupt world trade through the Suez Canal, and it would prevent critical food aid from reaching Yemen, potentially starving millions of people. That's not it. Saudi Arabia relies on desalination plants for its drinking water. Any oil spilled from the Safer would be close to the desalination plant and therefore would threaten Saudi Arabia's supply of drinking water. Coral reefs could be ruined too. Beaches would be spoiled. Plant and animal life would be lost. The Safer, in other words, posed an extraordinary environmental, health, and economic risk to the world. If a spill were to occur, the cleanup alone could cost $20 billion, not to mention an equal amount or more in disruption to world trade, all because two parties were fighting over $80 million of oil. So to recap, possibly $20 billion or more of damage could be caused by a fight over $80 million of oil. But still, progress was slow. Neither the Houthi rebels nor the internationally recognized Yemeni government was willing to give any ground. In the meantime, the situation went from bad to worse. Every day that went by, the ship's hull got weaker and weaker, increasing the risk that it would simply collapse. Seawater had flooded the engine room, potentially weakening pipes on board. That made it more likely the Safer would sink. It was also at risk of explosion. Oil is highly flammable, especially when it reacts with oxygen. So oil tankers have a system of inert gas. It's gas with low levels of oxygen. The gas surrounds the oil, eliminating the chance of explosion. On the Safer, though, the inert gas had dissipated. That made it a ticking time bomb. On Thursday, we'll talk about how disaster was averted and the political and economic challenges associated with it. Before we get to our quote of the week, I wanted to let you know that we're breathing some new life into the emails we send with every lesson. So if you're a free member at plainenglish.com, or if you signed up to get our lesson emails, then you know that JR sends the emails out every Monday and Thursday, and the emails have a summary of each lesson. Well, I think we can do better. So we are refreshing the emails so that they include a fun mix of learning, community, and fun. So going forward, actually we've started them already, but our emails will include updates to old lessons, links to fun things I think you'd enjoy seeing, quizzes, surveys, recommendations, and more. So if you're not getting the Monday and Thursday emails, this is a great time to start. Just go to plainenglish.com/mail, MAIL, plainenglish.com/mail, and that's where you can sign up. plainenglish.com/mail. Now, if you are getting the emails, that's great. Make sure to open them and reply back and tell us what you think of the new content. Today's quote of the week is from Franz Kafka. He said, "There are two cardinal sins from which all others spring: impatience and laziness. 2 cardinal sins from which all others spring means this is where they all start: impatience and laziness. So says the Austrian novelist Franz Kafka. There are 2 cardinal sins from which all others spring: impatience and laziness. Next up, I'll show you how to use the English expression accident waiting to happen. Accident waiting to happen. This is an expression that turns a normal sentence on its head. Happen is the verb we often use with accident. You might say, an accident happened on the way to work. I spilled coffee all over my pants in the car. With the expression accident waiting to happen, we turn that around and we use this expression to describe a dangerous or risky situation. With this expression, we are foreshadowing, we are predicting an accident in the future. In today's main story, we talked about the FSO Safer, an oil storage vessel moored off the coast of Yemen. A rebel group took control of the coast and therefore of the Safer. They then let it sit abandoned while it rusted and started to break down, posing a tremendous environmental risk. The rebel group didn't specifically want an environmental disaster, but for many years, they didn't appear too worried about the risk either. They didn't allow preventative maintenance to be done on the ship. They don't exactly have the expertise to transfer the oil to somewhere safer. They just let the FSO Safer sit out there in the Red Sea, slowly disintegrating. The UN realized this was an accident waiting to happen. So just to be clear, an accident did not happen. The bad thing didn't happen, but the UN predicted that something bad would happen. It was an easy prediction. Without corrective action, all this oil would spill out into the ocean. There was a high probability of an accident, and on Thursday, you'll learn about how an accident was averted. But we use this phrase, this is an accident waiting to happen. We use it when there's a high probability of an accident, especially a preventable one. Sometimes it doesn't happen, like with the FSO Safer, but sometimes it does happen. The Titan submersible was an accident waiting to happen, according to almost every expert on deep sea dives. This was the exploratory ship that a private company took to the site of the Titanic shipwreck. You heard about that in lessons 588 and 589. For years, experts in the field warned the company, OceanGate, and its founder, Stockton Rush, that the design was not adequate to dive deep into the ocean. It wasn't made of strong enough material. The experts said over and over for years to anyone who would listen, they said that this was an accident waiting to happen. They said it was dangerous, risky, and they predicted that something terrible would happen. To tragic effect, they were right. This is often pessimistic. The person saying this often has little or no chance to really make the situation better. You might say this on the road. If you see a car loaded with too much stuff and it looks like something is going to fall off the roof, that's an accident waiting to happen, and you just avoid that car. Sometimes, though, you can say this is an accident waiting to happen, and then you take corrective action. So if you're at home and you see one of your kids carrying a plate of food plus 2 drinks, and they're about to go through a doorway, and you can just imagine the whole thing spilling. You can just see it playing out in slow motion in your head. You can say, wait a second, this is an accident waiting to happen. Let me take some of that for you, and you take some of the things your son or daughter is carrying. You can describe a careless person as an accident waiting to happen. I won't say his name, but there was a kid in my class growing up. All right, I'll say his name. His first name was Michael. He just always seemed to be dropping something, getting hurt, breaking something. One time, he stuck a piece of metal into an electrical outlet and burned himself. So, yeah, you get the picture. The first time I ever heard this phrase, it was from my mom. She said about Michael, that kid is just an accident waiting to happen. All right, well, that is all for today's Plain English lesson number 606. Congratulations on reaching the end of another great lesson. And remember, we're going to pack some more great learning and fun into our weekly emails. So sign up for those by visiting plainenglish.com/mail, M-A-I-L. We'll be back on Thursday for lesson 607, where we'll continue the story of the FSO Safer. See you then.